In nearly every debate round, and especially in the beginning of the year, both on the affirmative and negative, you're going to be facing arguments that you haven't written responses to, or you haven't brainstormed responses to. And it's important to be able to develop responses quickly and on the fly so that you can respond to all these arguments. Often it is dropped arguments that lose you the round, especially when you're starting off. So this video will seek to help you to be able to develop quick responses that you can utilize on nearly any argument that will help you to be able to respond to points that you previously may not have researched evidence cards for, or you may not have written a blocked argument for. So something before I get into this is to understand, again, what the role of evidence plays in analysis or in argumentation. You have to realize that it's not evidence that makes the argument. What you want to utilize evidence for is to support your argument. So why this is important? This means that when you're developing arguments, when you're trying to think of responses, your first instinct shouldn't be to go to your evidence binder and see if you have something on the topic, or to make an argument. Rather, your first question should be, how can I respond to this, and what warrant or what evidence, what support can I use to uphold it? The evidence doesn't come first, the argument does. And thus, I'm going to be teaching you the importance of establishing good foundational arguments, especially when responding to your opponent's points. Again, a prerequisite for you being able to respond to these points, and even if you develop responses, the only way for you to be able to know what responses to develop and what arguments you need to respond to is by flowing properly. I recommend flowing by using one argument per one sheet of paper. I hold my flow paper vertically, and one may be dedicated to an advantage, one may be dedicated to disadvantage, to solvency, to inherency, to topicality arguments. And I stack them and write on going from left to right how the arguments are portrayed in the round. Responses come moving towards the right, and you're able to shift your papers around and perhaps stack them in the order that you want. That way you are clearly aware of where you want to go into the debate, what argument comes next. You can arrange disadvantage first, topicality next, solvency next, inherency next. That's one way I flow. I know other people have different methods, but I really recommend that way because it allows you to be more organized and to track your speeches. It also allows you to have a lot of room so you're not trying to cram in all of the responses or all of the warrants or the sources when you're trying to flow. So moving on, I think it's important to understand what arguments aren't really arguments and that you should stay away from. Often debaters fall into the bad habit of using these arguments because a lot of other debaters use these arguments. However, I don't see these as persuasive, and they end up hurting you in the long run when you face much better opponents. So there's three main arguments that I suggest you stay away from that are very popular. So the first is the argument that it is non-quantifiable. I know this is a very popular argument, and perhaps when the affirmative team says that their plan would benefit the economy, but they aren't able to produce exact numbers as to how much it will help or harm the economy, and your only response is they can't quantify it. The problem with this is that you haven't actually contested their claim. Thus, you have actually given a non-argument. In order for you to have defended yourself, you need to actually show reasons why it doesn't help the economy. But you haven't done that. All you're saying is cast doubt on the quantifiability of it, which doesn't negate the claim as a whole. You have to understand how arguments actually interact with the other team's arguments and give impacts. What is the impact that is not quantifiable? How does that even show their argument is not true? Second, I think you should stay away from is arguments in the form of questions. Always form your arguments in the form of statements. Don't ever leave the judge up with some question that you think they'll answer. Rather, just state your claim, give your warrant and your impact emphatically using statements. The third type of argument I think you should stay away from is uncomparative analysis. I alluded to this in my video about evidence comparison. You don't want to just bring up arguments, counter arguments that are completely the opposite of an opponent's claim without giving any comparative analysis. By comparing warrants, comparing evidence, comparing dates, comparing impacts. Just stating that they're wrong and that you're right without any comparison does nothing for the judge in the round and will make it extremely difficult for you to be able to win your position. So how can you respond to arguments that you haven't heard of before and be able to brainstorm arguments quickly? I'm going to be giving you 6 different ways that you can do this, but before this I want to break down the differentiation between offensive and defensive arguments. So again, when you're putting forth your best material, whether it be advantages for the affirmative or disadvantages for the negative, those are offensive arguments. Reasons to vote affirmative, reasons to vote negative. When you're defending against points, such as arguing against the affirmative advantages and saying that they won't be able to solve for them, or that there's no harm, or that it will lead to a minimal impact, those are defensive arguments. Winning those arguments don't win you the round, they merely minimize the offense that the other team has portrayed. And it's important to recognize when you're trying to do refutation whether or not your refutation is offensive or defensive. Does it turn your opponent's points into your points for your side, or does it merely defend? Because you have to realize that when you come to the end of the debate, defense will not win you the debate. At best, defense will help you to defend against your opponent's arguments so that you can outweigh them with your offense, your disadvantages, your advantages. So keep that in mind when I talk about 4 ways that you can refute and develop responses that are defensive, and 2 ways that are offensive. So the first defensive way is by challenging links. Again, this is akin to solvency in that you want to, whenever someone makes a logical argument, they always have some sort of link from getting to their claim, the way they warrant it, the way they impact it. You want to make sure that all of the claims in there, likely there are some breaks in the chains, and you want to show why those aren't true and the impact that they have in accessing the different positive advantages that they have, or the disadvantages that they have. An example of this is if the affirmative team says we should promote democracy in the Middle East because democracy leads to increased stability. However, they may not have given a link or warrant as to why US democracy promotion actually creates democracy in the Middle East. You can show they've given no link for them to get from their plan to their positive advantage and cut off the links. You can utilize this with nearly any argument. All it takes is establishing why the link is weak, why they don't have warrants for it, or if you have counter evidence to show why your warrants and your evidence or your reasonability is more compelling than your opponent's. The second is an offensive attack. It's called the link turn. Essentially what a link turn argues is that instead of perhaps your opponent saying the plan will help the economy, you actually turn the link and you say the plan will hurt the economy. Again, in order to make this, you're going to need to give warrants, comparative analysis, evidence perhaps, to be able to show why this is true. This is more of an evidence-based argument, but it's very useful one, especially if you utilize logical analysis. The third method for refutation is an impact turn. Again, this is offensive. Your opponent might say, so this is different than a link turn by saying, because it says that the impact will occur, you're still agreeing that the impact will occur, but you're just saying that the impact is bad when your opponent's saying that it's good. For example, your opponent might say, a certain policy leads to more of a certain tree, which is good. However, you can respond to that by saying, well, more of that tree would mean more squirrels and more invasive species, which is bad. So you turn the impact and you show that trees are bad instead of trees are good. Again, this is very useful in arguments where you're able to prepare responses to different impacts and turn them to benefit your side. Again, as with anything, you need claim, warrant, and impact. The fourth argument or response is more defensive. No warrant. You want to show that perhaps in their evidence they don't have warrants or reasons why the argument is true, they don't have enough support, it's not substantiated by evidence or analysis or logical reasoning. The fifth way you can respond is by saying, by arguing that there's no impact. Again, this is more of a defensive argument. For perhaps, just for fun, the affirmative plan is to save turtles, however, you're able to win that the affirmative plan only saves 10 turtles. but you have this huge disadvantage about the economy. What you want to say is that there's no impact to what is occurring. Or you may want to challenge your opponent's impasse and say, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we have financial education? Why does it matter that we fund a few bridge repairs? Push them for impasse so that you can use your sixth way of responding to any argument. If you're having trouble at all developing responses, this one is really easy to do. It's by merely outweighing. So it's best if you have defense to mitigate your opponent's offensive material. But in addition, you're not going to win on defense alone, unless the only way you're going to win is through offense, either by turning your opponent's argument or by outweighing with your own offensive material, whether it be disadvantages or advantages. So by outweighing, again, see my video on impact calculus, you're able to say, this argument may be true, however, even if it's true, this advantage is outweighed by our disadvantage, or this disadvantage is outweighed by our advantage. This gives you a clear way to establish reasons why this argument is not as strong as your opponent thinks it is, or to show to the judge why this is. So again, we went over some of the basics of arguments, looking at which arguments you should tend to stay away from because they don't actually contest claims or they don't actually give compelling analysis to the judge. And then we looked at 6 ways that you can respond and brainstorm arguments. This helps tremendously in round when you're trying to think about responses on the fly, or even out of round when you're trying to develop briefs against something, to understand that evidence doesn't make the argument. You make the argument which is substantiated by evidence.